Expectations, there's a quiet moment that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no slammed doors, no final text message. Just a pause where he looks at you, realizes something has changed. Not in him, in you. Because for the first time you're not confused. You're not asking. You're not hoping, you see clearly. Expectations. And when someone realizes you see through them, everything they relied on, control, uncertainty, manipulation, distance, starts to collapse. This is the moment that changes everything. Expectations. Let's talk about what actually happens when that realization hits him, and why this moment is more powerful than any confrontation you could ever have. Comes a moment in life that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't arrive with a dramatic conversation or a final argument. It arrives quietly, almost gently. Expectations, in the space between questions you no longer ask. For a long time you were searching for clarity. You wanted words to line up with actions. Expectations. You wanted explanations that made the confusion settle. You wanted reassurance, certainty, something solid enough to hold on to. And you asked for it not once, not twice, but many times. Expectations. Hoping that if you asked the right way, with the right tone, at the right moment, the truth would finally show itself. But then something changed. Not because he suddenly became honest. Expectations. Not because the situation magically improved. It changed because you began to notice how tired you were of asking. Expectation. You noticed how every question you asked seemed to circle back to the same emptiness. You realized that clarity delayed is often clarity denied. And slowly, expectation, almost without deciding it consciously, you stopped asking. This wasn't an act of revenge. It wasn't a strategy. It was exhaustion mixed with awakening. Expectations. You had reached a point where your nervous system could no longer carry the weight of uncertainty. Expectations. Research in emotional psychology shows that when people stay too long in ambiguous relationships, their stress levels remain elevated. Expectation, similar to being in a constant state of low-grade anxiety. You feel it in your chest, in your sleep, in the way you replay conversations in your head. You felt all of that. And one day, expectations, your body knew before your mind did you couldn't keep doing this. So the questions faded. Not because you didn't care, expectations, but because you finally understood that asking someone to clarify what they consistently avoid revealing is a losing game. When someone truly wants to be clear with you, expectations, they don't need to be chased. They don't need to be cornered by questions. They show you where you stand through consistency, presence, and effort. And once you saw that, expectations, the questions lost their purpose. That's when the shift happened. He noticed the silence where your questions used to live. At first, it confused him. Grown accustomed to being the one who held the answers, or at least withheld them. Your questions gave him time. They gave him space to delay decisions. Expectations, to stay comfortable in vagueness. When you asked, it meant you were still waiting, still hoping, still emotionally invested enough to seek permission for clarity. But when you stopped asking, expectations, something unsettled him, because silence from someone who once sought answers is not emptiness, it's awareness. Expectations. It signals that you're no longer standing in front of him with uncertainty in your hands. You're standing with understanding. And understanding changes the balance. In real life, expectations. This is the moment many people misunderstand. They think silence means indifference. But this kind of silence is different. It's grounded, it's steady. Expectations. It's the silence of someone who has connected the dots. You didn't need him to confirm what his actions had already made clear. Expectations. You accepted the message without demanding a better version of it. There's a study often referenced in relationship dynamics that talks about asymmetrical investment. Expectations, the idea that the person who is more emotionally invested tends to seek reassurance, while the less invested person controls the pace. For a long time, you were the one reaching out, asking, clarifying, hoping to stabilize something that was never meant to be stable in its current form. When you stopped asking, that asymmetry collapsed. Suddenly, expectation, there was no one reinforcing his position of emotional distance. And that's when he felt it. He felt the absence of your need for answers. He felt the loss of his leverage. Expectations. Because clarity seeking can unintentionally give power to someone who thrives on ambiguity. Your questions gave him the illusion that he could stay undecided without consequence. Silence told a different story. It said, I see what this is, I don't need you to explain it anymore. This is where emotional maturity begins to show. Expectations. Instead of demanding truth from someone unwilling to offer it, you chose to trust your perception. You chose to believe what you were experiencing rather than what you were being told. Not told, that takes courage. It also takes self-respect, because walking away from confusion means accepting an uncomfortable truth that sometimes is the clarity you're avoiding. People often underestimate how powerful this moment is. Not asking for clarity doesn't mean settling. It means refusing to negotiate with inconsistency. It means understanding that real connection doesn't require interrogation. Healthy relationships don't leave you guessing. Expectations. They don't keep you emotionally suspended. And once you truly understand that, your behavior changes naturally. You stopped asking because you no longer needed to convince him to show up. Patience. You realize that if someone wants to be present, they will be. If someone wants to choose you, they won't make you feel optional. That realization didn't harden you, it grounded you. Expectations. It gave you a kind of calm that comes from alignment with yourself. From his perspective, this was unexpected. He may not have been consciously manipulating you. Expectations. But he had grown comfortable with your pursuit of clarity. It reassured him that you were still emotionally available, still waiting, still invested. When that stopped, expectations. It forced him to confront something uncomfortable, the possibility that you were no longer waiting for him to decide. And that's a moment that changes people. Patience. Because when someone realizes you're no longer asking where you stand, they understand that you've chosen to stand on your own. You've stopped outsourcing your sense of security. Expectations. You've stopped tying your peace to their responses. And that's when the dynamic shifts from dependency to self-possession. You can see this play out in everyday life. A woman stops asking why her partner is distant, and suddenly he becomes more attentive. Not because he changed overnight, but because the structure he relied on disappeared. Expectations, his partner no longer initiating conversations about the relationship, and instead of relief he feels a quiet panic. Why? Patience. Because the absence of questions signals readiness to move forward without him, if necessary. This isn't about playing games, it's about evolution. When you stop asking for clarity, expectations, you're not withdrawing to punish someone. You're withdrawing to protect yourself. You're choosing emotional honesty over emotional exhaustion. You're saying without words, value myself enough to stop chasing certainty from someone who benefits from my uncertainty. And in that moment, whether he admits it or not, he realizes something important. Patience. He realizes that you're no longer standing in front of him asking to be seen. You're walking forward with your eyes open. You're no longer waiting for him to define the relationship, expectations, the direction, or the meaning. You've defined something for yourself. That realization hits differently. Because it's not loud, it's not confrontational. Expectations, it doesn't give him anything to argue against, it just exists. And once it exists, it can't be undone. You stopped asking for clarity, and in doing so, you became clear. Patience, clear about what you deserve. Clear about what you will no longer accept. Clear about the fact that love, respect, and presence should never feel like mysteries you have to solve. Expectations. And when someone realizes you've reached that clarity on your own, they understand that the old dynamic is gone. The version of you who waited, who questioned herself, who hoped for answers, expectations, that version has already moved on. That's the first signal. And once it's sent, everything else begins to change. Expectations. There is a certain kind of silence that settles in when someone realizes the familiar tricks no longer land the way they used to. It's not loud or dramatic, it's internal. Expectations. It's the moment when patterns that once gave him comfort suddenly feel useless in their hands. For a long time, expectations, he moved through the connection using methods that kept him safe and in control. Not always consciously, not always with cruelty. Sometimes it was simply habit. Expectations. Distance when things felt too real. Warmth when he sensed you pulling away. Just enough presence to keep you close. Just enough absence to keep you unsure. Expectations. These tactics worked because they fed on emotion. They relied on your reaction, your worry, your hope, your willingness to fill in the gaps with meaning. Psychology describes this as intermittent reinforcement, a pattern where unpredictable rewards create strong emotional attachment. Expectations. The same principle behind slot machines and notification addiction. You never know when the payoff will come, so you stay engaged, you stay invested. And for a long time, expectations. That uncertainty kept you orbiting around him. But something changed. You began to notice the pattern instead of getting lost in it. You started to recognize the rhythm of his behavior. Affection appeared right after you pulled back. The way distance showed up the moment things felt steady. Once you see a pattern clearly, it loses its power. Personal starts to feel predictable. And predictability breaks the spell. You stopped reacting the way you used to. Not out of bitterness, not out of strategy, expectations, but out of awareness. When the silence came, you didn't rush to fill it. When the mixed signals appeared, you didn't scramble to interpret them, accusations or demand explanations. You simply adjusted your energy, calmly, quietly. Patience. You stopped feeding the dynamic that required your emotional response to survive. That's when he noticed something was wrong. At first, it didn't register fully. Expectations, you may have assumed you were just busy or distracted. But over time, the lack of reaction became impossible to ignore. The messages that once made you anxious no longer seemed to move you. The delays that once triggered questions now passed without urgency. The emotional push and pull lost its effect. And without that effect, his old tactics had nothing to grip. Expectations. There's a particular discomfort that arises when someone realizes they can no longer influence you the way they once did. It forces self-awareness. Not always growth but awareness, expectations. Because control doesn't come from dominance, it comes from predictability. He knew how you would respond before. He could anticipate your emotions. That gave him a sense of stability, patience, even if the relationship itself was unstable. When your reactions changed, that stability disappeared. Expectations. Studies in attachment theory show that when one partner shifts from anxious engagement to secure detachment, the dynamic often reverses. Expectations. The person who once avoided emotional depth begins to feel unsettled. Not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because the structure they depended on is gone. Expectations. You were no longer available on demand. Your attention was no longer guaranteed. Your emotional availability was no longer automatic. And that realization hit him in waves. Expectations. He may have tested the old tactics again just to see. A delayed response here. A vague message there. A sudden burst of affection as if nothing had changed. Expectations. But the results were different this time. You didn't lean in. You didn't question yourself. You didn't overanalyze. You remained steady. Steadiness is the one thing these tactics cannot survive. You weren't cold. You weren't distant in a dramatic way. You were present, but not attached to the outcome. Expectations. That's what made it so powerful. Emotional independence doesn't announce itself. It simply shows up in how little it needs validation. And once someone senses that expectations, they realize the old ways won't work anymore. He began to understand that he could no longer pull you closer by pulling away. That tactic depended on your fear of losing him. Already faced that fear. You had already survived the idea of walking forward without him. And when someone no longer fears loss, manipulation loses its leverage. Expectations. This is where many people misunderstand the shift. They think it's about becoming indifferent. It's not. It's about becoming grounded. You didn't stop caring, you stopped chasing. Expectations. You stopped negotiating your worth through emotional reactions. You stopped proving your value through patience with inconsistency. And that choice changed everything. In real life, expectations. This often looks subtle. A partner notices that the arguments they used to avoid responsibility no longer escalate. A person realizes their emotional withdrawal no longer creates pursuit. Expectations. The familiar dance falls apart because one person has stepped out of rhythm. And when that happens, the one who relied on the dance feels exposed. Expectations. He realized that the distance he once used as protection now created distance he couldn't control. He realized that the affection he once rationed no longer guaranteed your attention. You realized that the uncertainty he once used as a buffer now pushed you further into clarity. And clarity is dangerous to someone who thrives in ambiguity. Expectation. There's also a deeper layer to this realization. When old tactics stop working, it forces a question that's hard to avoid. If I can't control the situation the way I used to, really offering, that question can be uncomfortable. It removes the distraction of games and leaves only intention behind. Some people rise to that moment. Others retreat. Expectations. But either way, the dynamic is permanently altered. You didn't change to provoke him. You changed because you grew. You reached a point where emotional self-respect outweighed emotional attachment. Where peace mattered more than possibility. Where consistency mattered more than chemistry. Growth made the old patterns obsolete. He felt it when he realized he could no longer predict you. Not because you became unpredictable, but because you became self-directed. Expectations. Your life no longer revolved around his availability. Your mood no longer hinged on his attention. You had reclaimed your center. Expectations. And when someone realizes they are no longer the center of your emotional world, they understand that influence has limits. This is often the moment when behavior shifts. Sometimes he leans in, suddenly offering what was missing before. Sometimes he becomes restless, unsure of how to regain the familiar dynamic. Sometimes he does nothing at all. The realization remains the same. The old ways are done. And you feel it too. Not as triumph, not as vindication, but as relief. Expectations. Because you're no longer participating in something that drains you. You're no longer responding to patterns that leave you questioning yourself. Expectations. You're no longer available for emotional loops that go nowhere. You've stepped into a space where your energy is your own. That's why this moment matters. Not because he noticed, but because you did. Because the instant his old tactics stopped working was the instant you stopped being shaped by them. You were no longer reacting to his behavior. You were responding to your own values. And that shift is irreversible. Once someone realizes their influence has faded, the relationship can never return to what it was. The illusion is broken. The rules have changed. And whether he adapts or not, you've already moved into a different way of being. He realized his old tactics no longer worked because you no longer needed them to define your experience. You had outgrown the dynamic that once held you. And in that realization, expectation, something far more important than control, was born. Freedom. There is a moment when you realize that raising your voice never really gave you power. Explaining yourself over and over didn't bring understanding. Defending your feelings didn't create safety. For a long time, You believed that if you could just say it the right way, expectations. Calm enough, strong enough, clear enough, something would finally change. You believed confrontation was proof of self-respect, that being heard required intensity, that silence meant losing. Expectations. But life has a way of teaching lessons slowly, through repetition, through exhaustion, through moments where you finally stop because you have nothing left to prove. Expectations. Your calm didn't arrive suddenly, it was built. It came from nights spent replaying conversations in your head, from the ache of feeling misunderstood. Expectations, from realizing that emotional chaos was costing you more than it was ever giving back. You didn't wake up one day and decide to be calm. Calm happened when you stopped fighting battles that never had winners. It happened when you understood that not every truth needs to be delivered loudly to be real. At first, calm felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. You were used to reacting, used to responding quickly, emotionally, passionately. Silence felt like weakness. Stillness felt like surrender. Patience. But something surprising happened when you stopped confronting and started observing. You saw more. You heard more. You noticed how often your words were being twisted, minimized, or ignored. Expectation. You noticed how confrontation gave him an escape, an argument to hide behind, a distraction from accountability, a way to turn the focus back on your reaction instead of his behavior. Psychologists often point out that emotionally immature people rely on conflict as cover. When emotions run high, responsibility becomes blurry. Voices get louder, facts get distorted, expectations and the original issue gets lost. You didn't know this at first. You just knew that every confrontation left you feeling drained, doubting yourself, wondering why being honest hurt so much. Expectations. Over time, your nervous system learned something important. Peace was safer than proving a point, so you stopped pushing. Not because you gave up, but because you woke up. Expectations. You stopped explaining your pain to someone who treated it like a debate. You stopped demanding respect from someone who only offered it conditionally. Expectations. You stopped trying to control the outcome and focused instead on controlling your response. And that's when your calm became something else entirely. It became unmistakable. It wasn't passive. It wasn't approval. It wasn't tolerance. It was clarity without chaos. It was the steady refusal to engage in emotional noise. You didn't shut down. You stayed present. You listened. You responded when necessary, briefly and honestly, without overexposing your heart. That kind of calm doesn't beg to be understood. Expectations. It stands firm whether it's understood or not. And that's what shook him. Because confrontation gave him something familiar. He knew how to navigate intensity. He knew how to deflect, delay. But your calm took away his map. There was nothing to argue against. Nothing to provoke. Nothing to twist. Your composure removed the drama he unconsciously relied on. Expectations. It forced him to sit with himself, with his actions, with the truth he could no longer avoid. Patience. There's something deeply unsettling about someone who remains composed when you expect them to break. Neuroscience shows that emotional regulation is contagious. Person stays grounded, it disrupts the emotional rhythm of the interaction. He expected anger, he expected tears, he expected urgency. Instead, he got steadiness, patience. And steadiness is confronting in its own way. You didn't threaten to leave, you didn't issue ultimatums. You didn't make speeches about what you deserved. Expectations. You simply adjusted how much access he had to your energy. You spoke less, but with more weight. You listened more, but trusted yourself more too. Expectation. You stopped chasing resolution and allowed reality to speak for itself. Real life shows this over and over. A woman stops arguing about effort, expectations, and suddenly the lack of effort becomes undeniable. A partner stops defending their boundaries, and the repeated crossing of those boundaries becomes obvious. Calm removes the fog. Expectations. It exposes patterns without needing commentary. And once patterns are exposed, denial becomes harder to maintain. Your calm didn't make him comfortable. It made him aware. Expectations. It showed him that you were no longer emotionally reactive, no longer predictable in your pain. You were no longer trying to win his understanding. You were choosing your own peace. That shift changes the entire dynamic because it sends a message without saying a word. I trust myself enough to stop fighting. People often confuse calm with indifference. Expectations. But this calm came from caring deeply, just not at the expense of yourself. You still felt everything. You just stopped letting those feelings run the conversation. Expectations. You learned that intensity doesn't equal truth and silence doesn't equal weakness. Sometimes silence is restraint, sometimes it's wisdom. Sometimes it's strength choosing not to perform. Expectations. He felt the difference in the way you responded, slower, in the way your words became fewer but firmer. He felt it when his usual tactics didn't spark the reaction he expected. Expectations. When guilt didn't move you, when defensiveness didn't hook you, when charm didn't distract you. Your calm made it impossible for him to avoid seeing the situation clearly. Expectations. Because you stopped blurring it with emotional noise. And the hardest part for him wasn't losing control of the conversation. It was losing control of the narrative. When you confronted him, expectations. He could paint you as emotional, demanding, difficult. Your calm took that away. Now there was no story where your reaction was the problem. There was only behavior and consequence. Expectations. Cause and action and response. This kind of calm doesn't come from detachment. It comes from self-respect. It comes from knowing that your worth doesn't need to be defended loudly. Patience. That the right people don't need to be convinced. That explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you only keeps you stuck in the same cycle. Calm also changed how you saw yourself. You began to trust your inner voice more than external validation. Expectations. You stopped measuring your value by how hard you were willing to fight for connection. You realized that love doesn't require constant negotiation. Expectation. Respect doesn't need to be argued into existence. And peace is not something you earn by enduring discomfort. Expectations. There's a quiet confidence that emerges when you stop reacting emotionally to what no longer aligns with you. You carry yourself differently. You speak differently. Expectations. You listen without absorbing what doesn't belong to you. That confidence isn't loud, but it's unmistakable. And once it's there, people feel it immediately. He realized it in the pauses. Expectations in the way you no longer rush to explain. In the way you didn't interrupt silence with reassurance. In the way you stayed composed even when things felt unresolved. Calm signals emotional independence. It says, I'm okay even without your validation. And that truth is more confronting than any argument could ever be. Because confrontation invites resistance. Calm invites reflection. Confrontation says, change. Calm says, this is who I am now. And the second message is harder to ignore. Expectations. You didn't need to prove your strength. You embodied it. You didn't need to win the argument. You outgrew the need to argue at all. And in doing so, patience. You shifted the power back to where it always belonged with you. Your calm became louder than any confrontation because it was rooted in truth, not reaction. It wasn't trying to convince. Expectations. It wasn't trying to control. It was simply the natural outcome of someone who chose clarity over chaos, self-respect over emotional survival, and peace over endless explanation. Expectations. And once someone witnesses that level of calm, they never forget it, because it reflects something back at them they can't argue with. Something they can't silence. Expectations. Something they can't manipulate. It reflects reality. There is a moment when someone looks at you and realizes the role they once played in your life has changed. Expectations, not because you pushed them out, not because you replaced them, but because you quietly stepped into yourself. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers, in small decisions. Expectations. In the way you stop reaching for reassurance and start trusting your own ground. For a long time, he believed he was essential to your sense of wholeness. Happiness leaned on his presence. That your confidence rose and fell with his attention. And maybe, once upon a time, it did. Not because you were weak, but because you were human. Expectations. Open, willing to attach hope to potential. You didn't realize it then, but you were slowly building a life where your emotional center sat outside yourself, for messages to feel calm. You waited for validation to feel chosen. You waited for consistency to feel safe. This is how many people learn love at first, patience, through connection mixed with dependence. Psychology often explains this as emotional outsourcing, when we hand over responsibility for our well-being to someone else. Expectations. It feels natural at the beginning. It feels like closeness. It feels like love. Until it doesn't. What changed wasn't your feelings for him, it was your relationship with yourself. Expectations. You began to notice how much energy it took to feel okay, how often you adjusted your mood based on his behavior, how frequently your inner peace was interrupted by wondering where you stood. Something inside you grew tired of that pattern. Not angry. Just tired, the kind of tired that doesn't scream but decides, so you started small. Patience. You filled your days with things that didn't revolve around him. You laughed without checking your phone. You made plans without waiting for confirmation. Expectations. You sat with your own thoughts without needing them to be interrupted by his voice. At first, it felt strange, almost disloyal, like you were doing something wrong by not needing him as much. It felt grounding, like coming home. This is how wholeness builds, not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet self-return. You began to listen to yourself again. Expectations. To notice what you enjoyed, what you tolerated, what drained you, what nourished you. You stopped abandoning yourself in moments of uncertainty. Patience. You stayed present with your own emotions instead of handing them off to someone else to manage. He noticed the difference before he understood it. Patience. He felt it in the way your happiness no longer depended on his availability. In the way you didn't collapse emotionally when he was distant. In the way your energy stayed steady. Patience, regardless of his mood. That steadiness confused him, because for a long time he believed he was the source of your balance. Patience. People often don't realize how much power they've been given until it's gently taken back. He had grown used to being the emotional reference point. The one whose actions set the tone. Expectations. The one who mattered most in determining how you felt. And suddenly, he wasn't. Not because you didn't care, but because you cared enough about yourself to stop giving that power away. Patience. There's research in emotional development that shows true security comes from internal regulation, not external validation. When someone learns to soothe themselves, to affirm themselves, expectation to find meaning within their own life, their relationships shift naturally. They stop clinging. They stop overgiving. They stop shrinking to keep someone close. Expectations. That's what he saw happening in you. You weren't cold. You weren't distant. You were present in a different way, a fuller way. You listened without losing yourself. Expectations. You connected without dissolving. You showed up without disappearing inside the relationship. Patience. And that kind of presence is unfamiliar to someone who is used to being needed more than being chosen. Expectations. He realized you no longer needed him to feel whole when he saw you stand steady even in uncertainty. When he saw you hold space for yourself instead of asking him to fill it. Expectations. When he noticed that your joy had roots beyond the relationship. That your sense of self didn't collapse in his absence. That realization landed quietly but deeply. For some people, it feels like love. It feels reassuring. It feels safe. But being needed is different from being chosen. Being needed says, I can't do this without you. Being chosen says, patience. I can do this on my own and I still choose you. The moment you became whole on your own, the dynamic shifted from dependency to choice. And choice is a different kind of connection. Requires more honesty, more responsibility, more presence. He may have felt a sense of loss he couldn't name. Not the loss of you, expectations, but the loss of the version of you that leaned on him for stability. That version made him feel significant without requiring him to fully show up. Your wholeness asked more of him. Expectations, not through demands but through contrast. It reflected back what was missing not in you but in the relationship. You didn't announce this transformation, you lived it. Expectations. You didn't tell him you no longer needed him. You showed it in how calmly you handled space. In how you didn't chase reassurance. In how you trusted yourself to be okay no matter the outcome. Expectations. That kind of self-trust is powerful. It shifts the energy in every interaction. Real life offers countless examples of this moment. The partner realizes the other has stopped relying on them emotionally and suddenly feels unsettled. Relationship that once thrived on imbalance struggles to find footing when both people stand equally. Not because equality is bad, but because imbalance was familiar. And familiarity can feel safer than growth. You weren't trying to teach him a lesson. You were learning one yourself. You learned that love doesn't complete you, it complements you. Expectations. That connection should add to your life, not become the foundation of your identity. That you are allowed to be whole before, during, and after any relationship. Expectations. There's a quiet dignity that comes with this realization. You no longer negotiate your worth through proximity. You no longer measure your value by how much someone needs you. Expectations. You understand that your wholeness isn't something someone gives you, it's something you carry. And once you carry it, everything else becomes optional, not essential. Patience. He saw it in the way you spoke with certainty instead of urgency. In the way you didn't over-explain your feelings. In the way you respected your own boundaries without apology. Expectations. Those are the markers of someone who has found their center. And once someone finds their center, they don't lose it easily. This doesn't mean you stopped loving deeply. Expectations. It means you stopped loving desperately. You stopped asking someone else to complete a story you had already begun to write for yourself. You allowed love to be a part of your life. Patience. Not the definition of it. For him, this realization may have been uncomfortable. It may have challenged his sense of importance. Expectations. It may have forced him to confront the difference between being wanted and being needed. But for you it was freeing. Patience. Because you no longer carried the weight of making the relationship work at the expense of yourself. You became whole not by cutting him out, but by inviting yourself back in. Expectations. By choosing self-connection over self-abandonment. By trusting that your worth existed long before his attention and would continue long after it. And when someone sees that in you, patience, truly sees it, they understand something profound. They understand that they are no longer the source of your strength. They are simply someone who gets to walk beside it. Expectations. That realization changes everything. There is a moment that arrives long after the damage is done, long after the signs were visible, long after the silence had already spoken. Expectations. It doesn't arrive when the arguments happen or when the distance first appears. It arrives later, quietly, when he finally looks at you and senses something he can't explain. Patience. You're still there, still speaking, still present in the room, but something essential is missing. The emotional thread that once tied you to every word, every mood, expectations, every reaction has already loosened. And in that moment, he realizes the truth. You didn't leave suddenly. You left slowly. And by the time he noticed, you were already gone emotionally. Expectations. This kind of leaving doesn't come from anger, it comes from acceptance. It begins the day you stop hoping that things will magically become different. Expectations. The day you stop waking up with expectations that keep disappointing you. At first you try harder, you explain more clearly, you give more patience. Expectations. You tell yourself that love means endurance, that understanding takes time, that people change if you stay long enough. And for a while, that belief keeps you there. Expectations. It keeps you emotionally invested even when your needs are unmet. But something inside you starts to shift when effort becomes one-sided. When care feels conditional. Connection feels like work instead of safety. You don't announce this shift, you barely notice it yourself at first. It shows up as emotional fatigue. As less urgency to fix things. Expectations. As fewer questions and longer pauses. You still care, but the care is quieter, less desperate, less consuming. Psychology often describes this as emotional withdrawal. Expectations. But that phrase doesn't capture the depth of it. This isn't pulling away to punish someone. This is what happens when your heart slowly protects itself. Expectations. When it realizes that staying open in the same way will only lead to more pain, so it adapts. It closes certain doors while leaving others slightly open, just in case. Until one day, expectations, even those doors no longer feel necessary. You begin to grieve the relationship while still inside it. This is the part most people never see. Expectations. You grieve the version of him you hoped he would become. You grieve the future you imagined. You grieve the effort you gave that wasn't returned. And grief changes you. It quiets you. Expectations. It matures you. It makes you honest in ways words never could. While he assumes everything is fine because you're no longer arguing, you're actually doing the hardest work of all. Internally, studies on relationship dissolution show that emotional disengagement often happens months before physical separation. By the time one person reacts, expectations, the other has already processed them. That's why the realization feels sudden to him, but feels inevitable to you. You stop bringing things up not because they stop mattering, expectations, but because you finally accepted they wouldn't change. You stopped reacting not because you didn't feel, but because you felt too much for too long. That constant emotional expression without emotional safety leads to burnout. So you conserved your energy, you redirected it inward. You began to detach gently, carefully. From his perspective, the shift felt subtle. You were calmer, more composed. Less demanding. He might have mistaken that for peace. Expectations, but peace and detachment can look similar from the outside. The difference is that peace is rooted in connection while detachment is rooted in self-preservation. Expectations. You were no longer fighting for the relationship. You were preparing yourself to be okay without it. You noticed that his absence didn't hurt the way it used to. Expectations didn't spike anxiety anymore. That the uncertainty no longer consumed your thoughts. These moments didn't feel empowering at first. They felt strange, almost sad. Expectations. Because part of you realized that the emotional bond was loosening, and with it, the version of you that loved without limits. This is where emotional leaving becomes real. Expectations. Not when you stop loving, but when loving no longer costs you your peace. When your heart no longer races at the possibility of losing him because you've already faced that fear. Expectations. You've already imagined life beyond this connection. You've already survived it internally. He realized too late because emotional labor is invisible until it's gone. Expectations. He didn't see the nights you cried quietly. The conversations you rehearsed but never had. The moments you chose understanding over expression. Expectations. He didn't see the internal negotiations you made with yourself, asking how much longer you could hold on without losing who you were. And when he finally looked at you closely, really looked, expectations, he sensed the absence of something he had taken for granted. The emotional availability, the softness, the way you used to lean in. He felt the distance not because you created it suddenly, expectations, but because you stopped crossing it for him. This realization often comes with confusion. He may wonder why you seem different, why you're less reactive. Expectations, why things feel quieter but heavier at the same time. He may try to reconnect through old patterns, offering small gestures, sudden attention, delayed effort. Expectations. But those things arrive too late. Not because you're unforgiving, but because your heart has already moved through the process of letting go. Expectations. There's a profound difference between being physically present and being emotionally available. You were still there in body, but your spirit had shifted. Expectations. You were no longer anchoring your sense of self to the relationship. You were no longer waiting to be chosen. You had already chosen yourself. Stories echo this pattern again and again. People often say they left without warning, when the truth is, the warning signs were emotional, not dramatic. The silence, the calm, expectations, the lack of reaction, the absence of expectations. Those are the signs of someone who has already done the work of detaching. You didn't slam the door, you didn't make a scene. Expectations. You simply stopped investing emotionally where there was no return. That kind of leaving doesn't require closure conversations or final explanations. It happens internally, quietly. Expectations, with dignity. When he realized, The shock wasn't that you were leaving, it was that he no longer had access to the version of you that tried. The version that hoped. The version that waited. Expectations. That version had already walked away emotionally, carrying lessons instead of resentment. This moment is painful for both sides, but in different ways. For him, expectations, it feels sudden and destabilizing. For you, it feels like relief mixed with sadness. Relief because you no longer feel trapped in uncertainty. Expectations, sadness because you know what it cost to get here, but above all, it feels real. You didn't become cold. You became clear. You didn't shut down. Expectations, you redirected your emotional energy toward yourself. You learned that staying emotionally present in a space that doesn't nourish you slowly erodes your sense of self. Expectations, so you chose preservation over persistence. The moment he realized you were already gone emotionally was the moment he finally saw the depth of what had been lost. Not just the relationship expectations, but the version of you who was willing to give endlessly. And by then, that version had transformed into someone stronger, steadier, and no longer willing to abandon herself. Patience. This kind of ending doesn't explode, it settles. It leaves behind understanding instead of chaos. And even though he noticed it too late, you noticed it exactly when you needed to. Expectations. Because emotional leaving isn't about running away, it's about walking toward yourself. When he realized you saw through him, the moment wasn't about him losing you. Patience. It was about him realizing he never truly had you, not because you were distant, but because you were always becoming stronger. Expectations. And the most powerful thing you can ever do isn't to expose someone else, is to see clearly, stand firmly, and walk forward without needing to be understood. Because when you do that, expect changes.